Welcome to Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean Part 20. Hope you've been enjoying the series thus far. Today, what we're going to go into is more sort of focus on Jamaica and the emancipation period, and also then the full release into slavery. We're then going to speak about how the country or the Caribbean would have been left sort of financially or economically poor because the Europeans would have up sticks and left and sort of switched focus to their own internal going ons, but also like the scramble for Africa was about to commence, which obviously switched the sort of global focus or European focus towards who was in control of Africa. Would have obviously had a dealing in who was going to be in control of supremacy. So that's what we're going to cover today. Let's get straight into this right now. Jamaica, by the 1800s, would have overtaken Barbados as the Caribbean jewel in the crown of the British colonisers. To see this type of revolt would have hurried influence on those walking the corridors of Parliament, which sometimes goes unmentioned, that wanted to believe the notion that abolition of slavery was Britain's own intuition. In the aftermath, utter chaos ensued, as the high number of culprits would have to face a form of martial law. International gossip of uncontrollable slaves would have damaged the imperialist psyche, that would have been weary of lessons from Haitian Revolution. A bad omen of losing traction signalled the summoning of military reinforcements, executions, public show trials, and vicious stalking of slaves that were ringleaders was to be the British objective. Meanwhile, slave retention had taken a massive blow, as many were now fugitive and scattered into the well-wooded island's dense interior. Never were they to return as slaves. So there we have it. After the Baptist War, the British decided to go on a bloodthirsty purge and obviously reprimand any of those or the main culprits of the actual rebellion of the Baptist War in 1831. Many slaves by this time had scattered into the dense interior. The place was in chaos from the 60,000 person rampage, of rebellion, which was for good reason. And it was just a couple of years now to emancipation, so never were they to return as slaves. So these people were free from sort of 1831, but officially would have been free just a few years later, as the law was passed to abolish the slave trade in the Caribbean around about 1834. Two years in the making, and slavery had officially been abolished in Jamaica, replaced by the manipulative apprentice period, where former slaves under yet another conformity had to reapply for work they had been bred to perform for 3 centuries. Strong lobbying across the colonies voiced concerns that slavery had been reshaped, as conditions, hours, and equal opportunities were never going to handle divisions of wealth issues. 1837, amidst a population that had begun to accept their African origins, but also hold agreement that he or she whose hands have planted the seeds in the soil of Jamaica has earned the right of sovereignty over the crown, which outlays prenuptial reparation plus mortgage remuneration many revolutions over. So there we have it. You've got slavery replaced by the apprentice period of about 3 years, which was where slaves pretty much had to reapply or just go back to working in the same place that they were working beforehand, but they were now labelled apprentices and would technically receive some type of working wage, but their conditions were pretty much still the same. There was no difference. They still felt enslaved. By this time, obviously, people are scattered around the island. It was in a little bit of disarray, that Jamaica was, right? However, a few years later, obviously, they would get their wish of freedom of slavery, but at the same time, they wanted sovereignty and just access to equal rights and opportunities, across the board. Deserted by colonial masters by the end of the 1800s, the former slaves were left to govern themselves in incremental measure, as profitability and exportation not being readily lucrative as previous centuries, conflated by a shift in purchasing patterns where mainland South America and the arrival of the train networks with superior procurement for mass production meant locations such as Colombia, Honduras, and Brazil were to bite serious chunks out of what used to be a market exclusively funneled through Britain's ex-slave colonies. In ceremony, the monarch was still head of state in the Caribbean. However, the global attention span was to take an endoscopic turn. The Caribbean, aborted by Central Powers as Europe had now colonised vast swathes of the African continent. Borders were still undetermined. Paranoia amongst European superpowers had begun to take priority. In what became known as the scramble for Africa, the Europeans with superior military prowess and unknown psychological control coercing the rest of the world where they set foot to hallucinate that they were much larger than they actually were, enabled the ability of socio-political dominance over Africa, India, and even China, who were made to concede position in what became to the Chinese patriot a century of humiliation, whereby Hong Kong had fought for and been won in both opium wars by the British, which ranks lofty as one of the most pivotal victories by a European superpower, with importance alongside that of the Greeks resisting Persian invasion, a feat that outperforms African defences. The scramble for Africa period saw focus of Europeans be set upon that of the mother continent. Only Ethiopia and Liberia would emerge unscathed from invasion, with Ethiopia protecting its borders from European penetration at the turn of the 20th century. So I remember I visited the Caribbean island of Dominica where my grandparents were from, and I was speaking to somebody just like out and about somewhere, and they were like producing or like farming bananas, and they said to me, yeah, like this year or whatever, we were voted as having the best bananas in the Americas. And I said, well, why isn't Dominica exporting? Why isn't that known? Why aren't they known for like that? Yeah, right, and being exported? And he goes, the train in South America. That's all he said in his broken English. And what he meant was like you can't compete with like South Americans. They've got a train network that can slowly go into the dense interior and pick up as much produce as need be, and obviously outsell them and sell at a cheaper rate, you know. So that sort of business that the Caribbean had, exportation, sugarcane, stuff like that, the mainland Americas would have eaten that up over time as they started to do, as technology improved. Moving on, right, going into like sort of the turn of the 19th century, you know, the Europeans had up sticks. They had their little warfares going on, but also they were scrambling for Africa. There was a meeting, I believe, of the nations in Europe. They were squabbling. They weren't happy. Everyone wanted a piece of Africa. So did the Italians, who weren't really involved in the colonial movement, but wanted to be on an equal footing with the rest of the Europeans, right? And have some type of colonial conquest behind them, as all the other major nations had done, right? So they decided to choose Ethiopia. One thing led to another. 17,000 Italian soldiers descended on Ethiopia against 100,000, I believe, Ethiopian soldiers. It's called the Battle of Adwa. I believe it was 1896. Menelik II was the regency in charge at the time, and they managed to beat the Italians in a famous victory called the Battle of Adwa, and that put paid to like obviously like European attempting to colonize Ethiopia, the cradle of civilization. But also I read like technically as well, Liberia never got technically like colonized either. So those are the only two countries within the whole of the African continent that were not colonized by the British or the Europeans, for want of a better word. And just moving things on, like even like India was still under sort of coming towards the end, but under colonial rule. You also had the British walking or marching on Beijing, so the Europeans were very, very, very strong in the 1800s, very, very dominant 1700s. But obviously things were going to come to a head, because in the next century, as we know, the scramble for Africa created a situation where I think it was Franz Ferdinand, something Ferdinand, I forgot, the name eludes me now, that was assassinated in Hungary or Austria or whatever, and it spiraled and it kicked off into the First World War, Second World War, to what we know right now, But anyway, that was the situation from the Caribbean perspective. The focus was sort of taken off of them, and it was all about Europe's inward battles with themselves, but also the massive commencing of the scramble for Africa was most important for who was going to dominate, which I'll go into, and I'm saying a bit too much now. Anyway, let's move on. Meanwhile, with European attention fixed on control of the more resourceful space as industrial advances and technological gadgets needing materials, Africa was now key to who would be at the helm in Europe. Moreover, it was widely recognised that whichever European nation had the greatest influence in Africa would transfer into the rankings for supremacy as the main catalyst for being in pole position. European internal insurgency provided the window of fortune the Caribbean needed to wrestle free and be on the road to full self-autonomy and act as if independent. So the Caribbeans were pretty much left by the Europeans, or their power was obviously losing its grip. In the 1830s, slavery had been abolished, but the monarchs still tried to rule over and made them sort of colonial subjects, so they were still attached to empire technically and still their subjects. So there was a push for just wanting to be independent, wanting to own what it is that you've worked for 300 years, which I would say is a fair entitlement, along with the indigenous whose land it is in the beginning. And obviously it was a push towards the next century, or what the story of the next century would be like countries all over the world seeking independence from European masters, European colonial masters, and that's what the story was going to be, and that's what we'll probably pick it up from next time, because this brings this episode to a conclusion. Hope you've enjoyed it. So once again, we covered the just what happened in Jamaica straight after the the Baptist War, where Jamaicans were still sort of reprimanded in a heavy way. A lot of people would have been sacrificed. Thousands of Jamaicans would have been potentially sacrificed, and just a few years later they would have been free subjects. So they were very unlucky, and even though it would have pushed for emancipation, they're all heroes throughout that period, because it would have had an effect in the corridors of Westminster. But it's a shame they would have lost their lives for people like me and the Jamaican diaspora to know, So good, happy, sad, bittersweet moment, because they would have made a difference, but they would have lost their lives in the process. And after that, obviously, they introduced the apprentice system, which was just like slavery reshaped. And slaves weren't happy about that. Then a further little push happened, and then in Parliament it was actioned and codified and ratified into law that slavery was to be no more, and that was obviously signalled the celebration for freedom. However, all these countries from inception, just like Haiti, would have been poor and put at an economic disadvantage. So equal opportunities and just rights to put yourself on an international level playing field, it would never have been there, and it's still not there to this day. Obviously, I don't know. I don't think any other country apart from Haiti paid back a serious loan to Crown, but no doubt they would have been economically disadvantaged from the beginnings, because financial instruments or just financial markets, the way it would have worked, anything from their parts of the world would have always had a value set at a cheaper rate than what it would need to be for them to flourish and become and develop affluence within their communities, So also as well, running government, administration, all of these things would have had to have been learnt on the job, or you'd have had to watch and learn, because all memory would have been, it's different. I can get on the internet now and read up about Africa going back at hundreds of thousands of years if I want, right? But these people would have had no computers, literacy rate would have been low, so they would have been left they were left in a bad situation. They were like free, but what hope would they have had, So, that's why sometimes these countries, it's not all about money. Sometimes you need to help in that respect, But anyway, that brings this episode to an end. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have once again delivered this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All right, love, bless, love, one.